Hi, everyone. I hear that the Monday evening lab at Mueller had to be canceled, and that as a result, you guys lost out on some lab time. And when I heard that, I was like, no, they can't go without a lab. So I'm making this video to just try to help you on your study of muscles since we have a practical exam coming up next week on the muscle module. So hopefully this week you've already been working on your visible body assignments because they're due Fridays at 5 p.m. typically. And so that should have introduced you to the appendicular muscles. And then also we have a fillable PDF on the appendicular muscles that is a really great tool for walking you through the muscles that you need to know. And because muscles are they can be a little overwhelming. There's a lot of them. I think there's like 60 something you have to memorize and recognize. So what we did in the new PDF is we grouped them based on either like their function, so all the muscles in each chart maybe do the same thing, that's very common, or they're located in the same location. So maybe they're on the anterior compartment of the arm versus the posterior compartment of the arm. So really pay attention to that as you work through that PDF. And even if you're using the print edition of your lab manual, one of the things that you can do in the charts where the muscles are listed is just jot some notes down on the side where you tell yourself where you would find those muscles. Because what you'll start to notice is their location often is key to what they do. So for example, all the muscles in the anterior compartment of the upper arm, they're all flexors of the elbow. So you don't have to memorize each muscle and its action separately. You just need to learn which muscles are in the anterior compartment, and then you know that they're all flexors. And so the posterior compartment, of course, is going to be extensors. And if you think about your legs, we're going to see something similar there too. So the muscles in your thigh, for example, they're almost all extensors at the knee. And the muscles in the back of your leg are going to be flexors of the knee. So try to see that pattern as you're studying muscles because it reduces the amount that you have to memorize, and I think that's important, and it makes your studying a little bit less stressful and a little bit easier for you. All right, I am going to just move myself off the screen for a moment so that I can show you where I'm at. This is not your exact Blackboard shell, but your Blackboard shell should look very similar to this. So if you go to the content link in your Blackboard course and then select Module 6, which is our muscle module, and then you should see this overview of the module at the top, and then scroll down and you should find the new Muscle Lab manual, which is an improved version of the one that's in your print lab manual. It might not be located here. It might be at the bottom of the page, and that's fine. Just scroll down looking for it. So when you open this, and I think I have it already open. Okay, here we go. So you'll see that this muscle activity guide is going to introduce you to muscles in general, which you should already be familiar with them because you did axial muscles the week before. And it will give you some important terms that you've learned from previous modules, just to remind yourself that these are key terms that we use when we talk about muscles. I even pointed out some of the bony landmarks for you, and these might be connected to those 5 muscles that you have to know the insertion and origin for. So in your lab manual, there are 5 muscles that are asterisked, and you do need to know their insertion and their origin. But you are not required to memorize the insertion and origin for all of the other muscles. So if I recall, those muscles are the sternocleidomastoid, biceps femoris, rectus femoris, gastrocnemius, and I'm missing one that I can't think of. It's in your lab manual, so if you would look that up, and if it pops into my head, I will tell you. So it'll give you this overview. Here's some important joints, because obviously if we're talking about muscles, we're talking about movement at the joints. And then there's directions on how to complete this activity, and basically the directions are this. open up visible body and use visible body to find the answers, because in this lab guide, what you're going to see is all of the images come from visible body. So they should be very easy for you to look at in invisible body and then know what they are to write it down. And the process of writing is what helps you to memorize. So let me just give you an example of how these charts work. So notice there's just 3 muscles in this chart. And it tells you right above the chart that these are muscles that act on the shoulder. And they're not all the muscles that act on the shoulder, but these muscles that act on the shoulder all originate on the ribs, the vertebra, and the occipital bone. Now, you don't have to memorize that for these muscles, but it gives you a really big hint at what they might do. Because remember, the origin is the bone that doesn't move, and the insertion is the bone that does move. And so it says that their insertions are on the scapula or the clavicle. So you can find this information in visible body and type it in. You don't have to, you're not responsible for it on the practical, but it may help you to understand why these muscles act on the scapula and the clavicle, because that is where they insert, and the insertion is where the movement occurs. And then this column is just an extra column for you so that you can jot down anything that might help you to remember that muscle. Like, how would you recognize it? How would you describe where you would find it? That kind of thing, just so that when you're looking at an image, you're like, oh, I know what muscle that is. All right, then it's going to ask you to identify the muscles. So these 3 muscles are visible in each of these diagrams, and so your job is going to be to look in visible body and just type in the muscle, and now you have a good image. And if you saw that image on the practical, you should hopefully be able to recognize it and be able to identify it. And then of course you would know the action. So it's really important for you to know the names of the muscles that are in the lab guide, to know how to spell them. You need to be able to recognize them, and you need to be able to describe their action. So that's what we're looking for on the practical exam. And then this lab guide or activity is going to walk you through all of these muscles. So here are some more muscles that are associated with the scapula, and they actually connect the scapula to the axial skeleton. So you may have covered some of these in the previous lab, but we're just taking the opportunity to repeat it here because repetition is great for learning. So again, you're going to look these up in visible body, make sure you complete the major action, and then any other information that you think would help you to recognize it. I think it's really important to note whether a muscle is superficial or deep, because that can be really important for being able to recognize it on the practical exam. And then again, you're going to label those muscles here. So once you've learned a little bit about what they do, then you're going to label the muscles based on this image. And there's some other little questions that might help make some connections for you. Then we're going to move into the muscles that move the arm at the shoulder. So again, you really want to focus on the major actions and any other information that would help you recognize or identify that muscle on the practical exam. You absolutely can complete the origin and insertion, and for some students that's very helpful for understanding how to recognize the muscle and what it might do. But for some students, it just clogs up their neurons even more and it makes it harder to remember. So you got to figure out what works best for you. And then you're going to be asked about some motion, what kinds of things can happen at the shoulder, and then asterisk or highlight each of the muscles that are part of the rotator cuff. So in your print edition of the lab manual, they talk about them being called sits as a way to remember them. So the S, I, T, and S are the first letters of the muscles that are involved in the rotator cuff. But watch out for teres minor and teres major, because they both start with T, they sound an awful lot alike, but only one of them is part of the rotator cuff. Then you're going to be looking at the prime movers of the arm, and you'll identify them on diagrams, and then identify which ones are superficial, and then you'll also identify prime movers that are located in the anterior skeleton, and they're right here in this image, no tricks. So this is walking you right through it to make it as easy as possible. And then we'll move to the back, and then we'll think about some synergists, muscles that help those muscles carry out a movement. Because eventually we're going to talk about antagonists and agonists. So we got to know what synergists are for us to be able to understand antagonists and agonists. So you're going to identify a few more muscles here, and then I've given you some really helpful information because I've already identified the flexors and extensors and pronators and supinators of the arm. So that information has already been given to you. Now you just need to figure out where are they located and how would you identify them. We're going to give you opportunities to label these muscles in diagrams, again, that you can find in Visible Body. So you're going to work through those and you'll get all the way to here. There are some video links through Anatomy Standard, but I think there's some trouble with the links coming through on the PDF with Blackboard. It is not the end of the world, but if you want to see them and the links aren't working, you can just Google Anatomy Standard pronation of the arm and it should pop right up for you. It's just really nice visual to see how the muscles are shortening and rotating the bones over each other. Then we move into the flexors and extensors of the lower arm. So again, I give you a lot of information here and then you'll be able to identify them individually. Take note that there's a lot of muscles we don't expect you to identify, so you only have to know the ones that are listed here in the lab guide. And then in the face-to-face lab, we did a quick little experiment using a spiker box, which records the electrical activity of muscle cells in order to understand agonists versus antagonists. So we looked at the biceps and the triceps, and in our experiment, we were discussing flexion at the elbow, which means biceps is the agonist and triceps is the antagonist. And then you can figure out what the synergists are. But also you need to think about what if instead of talking about flexion at the elbow, what if we ask about extension at the elbow? Who's the agonist then and who's the antagonist in that situation? Because it's going to change up. Those are relative terms. So you'll see in your lab guide that there are some directions for how to do the myogram, but you're not going to be asked to do a myogram during the practical exam. You just need to understand antagonists and agonists. And then the last part of the lab guide looks at the muscles of the lower limb. And again, these muscles are in the print version of your lab manual too, so you can really use either one, although this is the most current version of the lab guide, and so it might be best to work from this one, but you could use the paper one as extra practice for recognizing and labeling pictures. I don't think that would hurt at all. So you're going to go through these charts and you'll notice that they're grouped together. So the gluteal group, the lateral rotator group, which means it's telling you what they do. And then there's the adductor group, which means they are telling you what they do. And the iliopsoas group, they are both involved in flexion. These are not all of the muscles in each of these categories. These are just representative muscles in these categories, but you only have to recognize and identify the ones that we list. You don't have to know all of the muscles that you might see in pictures like in your textbook or in Visible Body, just the ones listed in the charts. So, and then I give you some opportunities to identify those same muscles in images, and you can work through those. Again, use Visible Body. This is not a test. You're supposed to be taking the information from a reference and applying it here. And it will work you down into the flexors and extensors of the knee. Again, notice they are all grouped together, so you only have to memorize one action for all of the muscles that are in that compartment, so a lot less to memorize. Here's an opportunity to label those muscles so that you can recognize them on the practical. And that goes for both the anterior and posterior, bringing us all the way down to the lower leg, looking at some of the muscles that act on the ankle. We only look at really one flexor and then a number of extensors on the back of the calf, and a little bit of muscles that act on the toes. So that will walk you through all of these muscles that you need to know. And then at the very end, there's a bunch of practice questions to see if you were picking up on some of the key ideas from the lab activity. So you can use this to help prepare. Now, I also want to show you a couple more things. So let me just close this guide out. So definitely spend time in this activity completing that. I do also want to remind you that you have assigned modules on the muscular system. So if we click here, it will bring us to the muscular system, and you can click on any one of these. So if you're interested in which muscles have to do with chewing, you can just click right here. Or if you want to know what about those prime movers of the arm? Or what about synergists or the rotator cuff? You could just click right here and it will bring you right to that information, all right? Or the other option is you can click on the My Apps right here and then click on Launch Anatomy Suite, and it will bring you to this part of visible body. And then you can click on the muscular system, for example, and then you can just start clicking on muscles and it will identify. Let me move myself out. Hi again. Let me just move myself out of the way so you can see the name of the muscle by highlighting it. And then if you click on the little book right here, it'll give you the origin and the insertion. But most importantly for us, it'll give you the action. So you can get all the information you need for your completing your lab activity by going through visible body and clicking on the muscles that you need to know. And then just in case you're not aware, this will magnify or reduce. And then you can also move it around, or if you want to move it down, whatever you need to do. You can get pronunciation if you need that. There's if you want to see what can go wrong. I mean, we don't really cover that, but sometimes it's just interesting. So you can click there and get, like some pathologies that would impact pec major. Just, don't do too much. You've got a big test coming up. Focus on what's going to be on that test, okay? And I think, there's one other place I want to just remind you about, which is if you go in your Blackboard course for the lab, don't forget that you have these PowerPoints and they have a voiceover. So they will go through and discuss each of the muscles that you need to know. So that could be really helpful. And it's broken up. You can see there's like the histology that you learned the first week and the axial muscles from the first week, and then there's muscles of the extremities. That was this week's. Don't forget you got visible body assignments, and then there is also, to help you prepare for the practical, you have the lab manual review activities. So make sure you get in there and you do those activities. They use images right from your lab manual, so they're great practice, and it gives you feedback right away if you're right or you're wrong. So definitely use those. And then don't forget about the practice practicals. So if you scroll down, we're in practical 3 right now. So there's one practice practical on the histology and axial muscles, and then a second one on the appendicular muscles. Now, let me just give you one last hint about how to use these. You want to get a piece of paper out and you want to look at the slide with the question, and before you click to the answer slide, you want to write it down. Don't fool yourself by just clicking to the answer slide and being like, oh yeah, that's the answer. I knew that. No, you didn't. If you couldn't write it down, you didn't really know it. And it takes practice. You might have to try 3 or 4 or 5 times. So if you look at it and you try to write it down and you don't know the answer at all, or maybe you know the answer but you don't know how to spell it, then you go to the answer slide, you look at it, and you're like, okay, that's the answer. Then you go back to the question slide and now you try to write it down again. And if you can write it down that time, great. Go on to the next question and do this process all over again. And then every 5 or 10 questions, start back at the beginning and write down all the answers again without looking at the answer slide until you can do it without looking at the answer slides. Those practice practicals are incredibly powerful tools for preparing for the actual practical exam, but only if you use them in a way that works for learning and memory. And how I've just described, that's the way. It's not just clicking through them and being like, We're all guilty of it. I've done it myself, but it doesn't pay off grade-wise. Okay, so I hope this gives you some information that you can work with. You can do this. You have about 40 muscles, I think, if I counted it right, for appendicular that you need to learn. Hopefully, you've already locked down on the axial muscles and the histology from the previous week, and you're just working on the appendicular muscles now. Good luck, and I hope you rock out the next practical exam.